Thanks to everybody. Thank you to all active, current, and going into the military. Give them a round of applause. Is anybody there now? You willing to stand up? Thank you. All right. Because of some interesting goings-on elsewhere, out of my control, I have permission to philander and talk about for about 10 minutes before we really get down to the meat and bones of the issue. First off, how many of you have world built before? Built technology, that kind of thing? All right, so a pretty good portion of you. So here, I will give you a very good example of how a short period of time can significantly change what we think. Go ahead and take out your cell phone. And if you're comfortable, hold it over your head. Now, with the exception of mine, 1, 2, maybe 3 others, all of you, well, I admit this is a bit of a trick question. I asked you to hold up cell phones. Most of y'all held up smartphones. The very important difference is, this is a cell phone. It makes phone calls. It sends messages via the short messaging system, first developed in the 1980s. Well, thank you. Kindred spirits of the light. Yeah, they are. I dropped this thing out of a 2-story building, picked it up, cracking the screen, it was fine. Now here's the other fun part. This is a cell phone. That's all it does. It takes pictures because it has a little baby camera in it. But that's not what it's built for. What most of you guys are carrying are smartphones. Now smartphones have the unique ability to act as computers. And I say unique because 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 15, was basically unheard of. This is an iPod 5th generation. This does basically all the same thing my computer does in a much smaller handheld package. 20 years of technological evolution in the palm of your hand. Now, I won't make this sound like an Apple commercial, but like these things have their own flaws, as well as do basically everything. But the important part remains. 30 years of development is an absolute shock in this kind of technological aspect. 30 years of shipbuilding. Let's take a look between 1930 and 1950. Honestly, only big development was the advent of the aircraft carrier, and that's military. Otherwise, shipbuilding and such hasn't changed much. No, 50s, 60s, yeah, you're right, 60s. I got my math wrong. I was never a math major. That's why I do history, not math. I do ponies too, that's the fun part. So when you look at it, that 30-year technological difference, except at the birth of the industry, hasn't changed much. Let's look at airplanes. In 100 years, we went from wood, glue, and stick biplane gliders to the Concorde. In 100 years, a single human lifetime has seen one of the strongest technological changes the human race has ever seen. Well, the moon's coming later. I'm just talking about on Earth, because we've only been to the moon by one country 6 or 7 times, and that's landing on there. The Soviets did it, and the Russians did it, and a couple other people did it. But still, wood and paper biplanes, but powered by a motorcycle engine, or was it a lawnmower engine? Feel free to correct me on that. Does anybody know?
Custom built by Mary Kay.
Thank you. Custom built baby engine.
Aluminum, worth its weight in silver.
To the Concorde.
At the time.
Now the Concorde is remarkable because before it was removed from service, it was the single supersonic airliner. This thing would fly so high, you could see the curvature of the Earth. A friend of mine had the privilege of riding in one of these beauties before they were finally taken out of service due to engine failures, because when you have something going that fast, if it falls out of the sky, there are bound to be some problems. But the fact remains, 100 years, that amazing development. Now let's look. Now, this may be a little bit of a personal question for you guys, but how many people here remember before cell phones were smaller than your fist? Go ahead and raise your hand. I remember payphones too. Now, how many of you guys remember life before the internet? no internet at all. Like, had to go down to, like, I remember my father telling me stories. He's like, you know, you guys have it easy these days. If I want to know something, Wikipedia, 15, 20 seconds with a good internet connection.
The web.
Well, that too. But the web was, that's another interesting development that we'll get to later. Right now I'm just filling in space until we can officially begin. So, before we really get into the meat and bones of the matter, or the lovely leafy greens if you're vegetarian, I respect all of you guys. Light amplified by stimulated emission of radiation. Right up in the back there? Okay. In the front?
Any tool used to do a job in a better way than the previous tool was used for.
Okay. So you guys have heard the definitions we're all throwing together. So the question now is, how does this technology equate to what we are today? And the question I'm sure you've all been waiting for, how does this relate to a television show about ponies? Well, either way, let us begin. On September 7th, in 1908, the very first Model T, developed by Henry Ford, was put onto the market. And this was remarkable because it was the first time an automobile was available to the masses. Now, imagine, I know this is going to be pretty hard, and maybe some of us can't do it. Imagine a life without the automobile in the modern day. That symbol of American freedom, like, how many of you guys had that thrill when your folks or people you were with handed you that car key and said, go on ahead?
Nope.
First time you had that still freedom though. Maybe it was a bicycle, a motorbike. For me, it was a bicycle. They said, here's a bicycle, be back before dark, go home. Just go away, we're doing stuff in the house, we're painting. Now, so assuming I stopped kicking things. Now that was the first car. Now we are almost just over 100 years later, and Tesla Motors develops the Tesla Model S. Now, I'll skip the specific details about it, but it's a 237.5 watt hour. Now, to break that down, that's about how much energy it's going to use, how much electricity it's going to use in an hour. And I'm no electrical engineer, so I can't really explain the specifics. But some people better at math than I have done the math, and they said that if you wanted to make a car that efficient, you'd have to make it about 89.5 miles per gallon. That kind of shift is a birth of a new industry that we can see today. That's also what I was talking about with the phone. That shift, and as you can see, has had a huge effect on us in the real world. So it's safe to assume that specific technology, specific bits and bobs of nifty doodads, and not only their presence, but their conspicuous absence, the obvious fact that they are not there, is also going to strongly affect what we see in the show. See, technology versus magic. Now that, I'm sure, is one of the more burning questions a lot of you are going to have. Am I right? Mm-hmm. Of course, we could just hand wave it away and say, it's all magic. And then I get up, we go home, you guys go to the vendor hall, do your own thing. Discussion over. But in this case, normally I like to make as few assumptions as possible when dealing with any part of the show. We just have what they say, and we work from there. Unfortunately, we're going to have to make a few assumptions here. And I know what they say about assumptions, but still, we're going to assume that electricity is a real force in the world. I think it was Heinlein, feel free to correct me, who said, Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Clark.
Arthur C. Clarke, that was it. Was he the guy who invented the law of robotics? I think. Isaac Asimov. Okay. They did agree, though. I love a geek crowd. I'm also at a Brony convention, so I shouldn't have expected this anyway. But still, the fact remains, technology is only what we understand. For example, it was long thought that weather was done by magic and voodoo, but really it's just a very complex sequence of numbers. I know it's a harsh thing to know, but it is something we have to know, unfortunately.
Ones and zeros.
The universe is ones and zeros, basically. The fun part, we know, I can tell you that emotions, the way we think and the way we feel and what we perceive as beauty are all numbers. I don't understand the numbers, but everything can be broken down into it. Here's a very little interesting tidbit in the human language. You know how there are 26 letters in the English alphabet, right? Give me a word. Apple. Apple is 5. 5 is 4. You guys know about the cosmic number? Because of the way our speech algorithm, the mathematical equation behind the speech of the English language, everything basically breaks down to 4. Because 4, I don't know the specifics behind it, but it's one of those really nifty party tricks. Now the trick is, take a word apple. A-P-P-L-E. 5 letters. Apple turns into 5. F-I-V-E. 5 is 4. Tree. T-R-E-E. 4. A. 1. 1 is 3. 3 is 5. 5 is 4. Now that is one of the weirdest things in the English language. I don't know if it works for other languages. I know a smattering of French and a smattering of German and a smattering of Spanish, but English is the one language I'm fluent in. So that's a free experiment you can try on your friends at some point, give them the cosmic number trick. It's a great thing at parties. Until someone figures it out, then you look a lot less cool. Speaking of experience there.
Already figured it out.
On January 9th, in 2008, Steve Jobs unveiled the Apple iPhone 1 at a keynote presentation at Macworld. This is another very powerful shift because it turned this into this. Not this specifically, but one of these that makes phone calls. I don't have that kind of money. Question?
Research in motion in BlackBerry.
Sorry?
Both predate the iPhone by a significant amount.
True, but they didn't have the same user popularity. They were mostly restricted to business sectors, and they didn't reach the same base, and they didn't have the same easy to use notion. Thank you. The same impact. And now I'm not going to argue about which is better, which is worse, Mac or Apple. As you can see, I have Apple and, or wait, those are the same things. Apple and Windows. Well, I'm glad I'm making y'all laugh. That's the important part. You guys are having a good time. Right up in front.
I just want to clarify. So we're going to be focusing on the part of technology that the general population is aware of, right?
Yes, we can talk about the cutting edge all we want, but the cutting edge isn't what everybody has.
So not just what Twilight Sparkle has, but what everyone has.
Right on the money. The utterly massive changes these have all brought about has been remarkable. And we can see that in our own society. I said that before, maybe 5 minutes ago. But the important part remains. How on earth does this affect a television show? And I told you guys I would get there soon, sooner or later, and looks like we're there now. Now, all devices have one thing in common. Every single person's cell phone, house, the lights above us needs something. Power. Now, in the phone, it's a lithium-ion cadmium battery. In this device, it's the same thing, I guess. My laptop has the same sort of thing. But these are all stored power. You have to get it from somewhere, right? So the question is raised, where did it come from? No, I said it before and I'll say it again. I am not an electrical engineer by trade. I'm a historian. So, I can't speak for the specifics of a power grid. But the very basic thing of a power grid is if you got basically 2, maybe 3 sections, depending where you're going. You have the super high ultra power, which is the kind of stuff where you touch it and you'll fly 30 feet. You've got lower below that, which is the kind of stuff where you'll touch it and you'll zap yourself pretty bad, but it won't have any permanent effects. And that requires its own industrial base. And I'm not going to talk specifically about the industrial base it requires. I didn't do enough research on that. And I won't pretend to. And y'all seem like a good crowd, and I've already caught my mistake so far, so I'm not going to pretend to know what I don't with you guys. Hats off to you guys. So basically, like I said, there's the 2 sections. And the power has to come from somewhere, which means you're going to need 2 big things. Generation stations, be it wind, hydrothermal, hydroelectric, nuclear, coal, oil, stuff like that, and transmission stations. Now, all those can be built underground, and that's the other assumption that I told you about I was going to have to make earlier. We're going to have to assume that because we don't see any overhead power lines, there's either a Tesla-like transmission of electricity through the air or underground power lines. Now, underground power lines pretty much all over the place. The city of Boston, for example. Now, I'm from Boston, and you talk to somebody about Boston about the Big Dig, and they're liable to punch you. But what the Big Dig did is it moved a lot of the city's power lines from along the freeway down underground. So we know it's definitely possible. Transatlantic cables running across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean have been running for hundreds of years. So the idea of having that kind of power underground isn't actually all that abnormal. But that still leaves us with one thing. Where's the power coming from? And there is where you have direct evidence from the show itself. In one episode, I forget the title.
It's about time.
That was very well. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Both, though. It appears twice.
Wow, the sarcasm in this room is pretty high.
There will be no mistakes.
Anyway, we may return to our line of discussion. Thank you. We've seen a big dam. Dams serve 2 big purposes now. 2 big purposes. Holding back water and power generation. Power generation can be through what it's built on or the water running through it. The Hoover Dam it used to be the biggest hydroelectric dam in the world. Now that's the Three Gorges Dam in China. But still, a dam that size and that scope is really difficult to build. Hoover Dam took a long time to build itself and took a lot of people with it to build it. But we're not going to look at that today. We're just looking at what the dam does. Now, dams provide power through their turbines. Basically, the sluice gates, the gates the water flows in through the thing, turn these big turbines. And there's a magnet inside and a magnet outside, and they spin against one another, and through the magical power of, I don't know, generate wonderful, wonderful electricity that powers all of the modern conveniences we have today. So power is the keystone of our civilization. If we ran out of coal, fossil fuels, that's one of the biggest concerns right now. So power is important. We've established that. Moving power is important. We've established that too. So the absence of overhead power lines and the fact that we're having to assume they're underground power lines has its own problems. Underground power lines, well, sometimes they're finicky, they're hard to service, but they're generally safe. So that in a world where you have Pegasus ponies flying around, you don't want them to hit power lines, that would make for some rather crispy chicken. That's true, but we are working with a different world here. So there is some other evidence other than me just saying they should be underground. When you look at the world and you look at the way they think, that also works out too. So underground power lines, we've established this 15 million times and I'm probably boring you guys with it. Power. Power. Keystone of everything. Incredibly important. Nuclear power plants use heat, other ways just use electricity. It's a pretty fascinating subject. I wasted about 2 hours on Wikipedia clicking through links. I recommend it at some point. The Wiki Walk, I think?
When you walk over.
Thank you. Either way, My Little Pony was a show about, as you expect, ponies. So the society inherent is split into 3 specific castes, basically. Earth ponies, Pegasi, and unicorns. Pegasi, as you all know, have the natural ability to fly, natural ability to magic, and the natural ability to do things, to build things really well. So we can assume that Earth ponies, builders, are going to be doing a lot of this. And the Pegasus ponies, the flyers, are going to act as their own support. The reason the Wright brothers invented the airplane was because it's been humanity's dream to fly ever since the days of Icarus, a guy who flew too close to the sun and spiraled out. And ever since, question over there?
Did we invent the hot air balloon before we invented the airplane?
We did, but that was not powered flight. We had the hot air balloon and we were up in the clouds. I think it was the French guys who did it first, maybe the Italians. It was French?
Over the mountain,
Either way, you just kind of floated around, you were at mercy of the winds. Powered flight was a pipe dream for humanity until the Wright brothers built their device. And within 100 years, Concorde from a glider. You can actually see this. You can actually see the original glider at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. I highly recommend it. So, imagine a world where the airplane didn't exist, not because we didn't build it, but because we didn't need it. The only thing that you can imagine really being needed is long-haul cargo. And one of the most efficient ways to do that is with a hot air balloon. Or better yet, a sky chariot. I don't know how the sky chariots fly. If you build them out of regular wood, they just, kind of drag it along the ground. But the fact is, we've seen them. We've seen sky chariots, and that's their own interesting thing. But to move massive amounts of cargo, you need something else. Aerial, lots of cargo. Over the ocean, hot air balloons, dirigibles. Blimps wouldn't work too well. Dirigibles would. In fact, dirigibles were a pretty awesome invention until a very famous one caught fire. But that was because it was filled with the wrong gas.
Their fault, it was an embargo.
That too.
The hydrogen didn't go up with the combination.
Dirigibles got a really bad rep after that. It's like how passenger liners got a bad rep after Titanic. She was built as the safest, vaunted as the safest. She wasn't. She sank. Terrible story. So now we are bringing on to the next thing. We've seen locomotives, but what do locomotives move on? Steam power. They move on steam. Now, steam can be generated a lot of ways. Nuclear power plants use steam, but they have a nuclear reactor, and I wouldn't exactly feel safe in the world outside of the world of Fallout with a nuclear-powered train. If I may diverge a bit, that's the one. The United States, go ahead.
Well, it could have been water vapor.
The furnace is in a slightly different compartment than the boiler. The boilers, or
Mhm.
the water tanks are behind it and piped in. You don't store them in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
So you end up with both smoke vent and the steam vent.
They just mix out of the, well, in the ships you call it funnels. I don't actually know what it's called in a locomotive. The chimney, the smokestack at the front of the device. The Russians actually the Soviets actually built a nuclear-powered train.
They would.
It worked about as well as you'd expect. Now, the American Air Force, of course, never to be outdone, built a nuclear-powered airplane. Surprisingly enough, it actually worked. They never got past testing phase, but the nuclear engine never powered anything other than the electronic systems on board. But they did actually fly a nuclear airplane. The biggest problem was that it was supposed to take cargo, but all that weight was taken up by the giant lead disc protecting the crew. But again, little competition there. We built a nuclear airplane. It worked. What then?
Back on the show, when you were mentioning about airships, I do remember, wasn't it Rarity christened an airship on one of the episodes?
Yeah, the episode was fancy.
Not sure what it was, whether it was Zeppelin or
Dirigible. It had a rigid structure on the outside. It had beams running along it.
On the outside. The inside is where it's going to be next to be safer. That's just a development of technology. We can talk about the RL1 later, but we got another question over here.
My question was the train. Wouldn't it be possible, though, since they have unicorns, to use the magic that they could power the trains in such with magical means?
Absolutely.
Even with the Earth comes in, when they went to Appaloosa, the train was being pulled by the Earth comes.
Absolutely.
That is that seems impossible.
The thing is, it's like I said, we can assume that things are powered by magic, but right up front.
I mean, you can't forget that all three races of ponies all have magic within them. It's just that they express it differently.
Pegasi wings aren't big enough to lift them
But they're weightless because of magic.
Also, their bones are like, they have wing bones like bats, not like birds. You see Rainbow Dash's X-ray.
Now, we can all argue about our own canon and our own theories and all, but I'm the one with the table, so I get to argue mine. You see, Ponyville as we see it is a pretty small town, about the size of, may say, Algonquin, Connecticut. It's not big, and it's a town, but it's still pretty reasonable. Now, you could also look alternatively at the city of Framingham in Massachusetts. Now, the city of Framingham has the unique distinction of being the biggest town in the world, or at least in the United States. Square footage and population, biggest town, but it's still a town, and it has its own power grid. The hydroelectric dam outside of Ponyville is by no means small. The largest hydroelectric dam in the world, Three Gorges Dam, produces about 22,500 megawatts of power, of electricity. So, Ponyville's dam, let's say 100 megawatts. And that's still enough for the town, that's still enough to be pumped out in the neighboring area. But the big question remains, how does this affect the people? We could argue about what we do know and what we don't know about the technology and our own canons about it, but what's really remarkable is how this affects people. Imagine the modern world if X-ray machines didn't exist. It wouldn't be very pretty. But we see X-ray machines in the show, which implies a basic understanding of radioactivity and that sort of study. Again, we have locomotives, but we're not looking at the locomotives this time. Look at the rails. Building something that size and that scope requires a good mindset. You have to have organization. You have to have, for all intents and purposes, a working class. A future vision goal.
Decent metallurgy.
Metallurgy. Measurement system, too. Now, there's the interesting part. But are they all using the same measurements? Because we don't in our world. So the very interesting way we can look at it is how it affects people. Now, imagine, if you will, play along with me here. If unicorns and ponies and Pegasi, say Pegasi existed in our world, or at least winged humans, angelics. Now, the math behind that says you'd have to have hollow bones, a radically reorganized structure, and a wingspan of about 12 feet. But we wouldn't need airplanes. Not for massive moving. We wouldn't have airplanes the same way. And that's just affecting us. Imagine the pony world without Pegasi. Can you do that? Let's play nice here now.
I don't want to imagine a pony world without Rainbow Danger Dash, but I can do it. It just isn't as cool.
And the thing is, that would radically reorganize their society because they would have an entire abilitied, I know it's a fancy word, abilitied, I think I just made it up, enabled race, a subset of their species that enables them to act a certain way. That change, that fundamental differences, they're three classes that have to work together. It provides a very interesting lesson on the interconnectivity of us and how we all have to work together for our own. And I won't argue whether or not that was intentional if I'm reading too much into it, but then again, I'm giving a panel at BronyCon, so I'm probably reading too much into something. But the way they all work together, that is also very interesting. It suggests a different kind of competitive spirit, which we see in the races, and we see in each other, and we see in our own lives. We haven't seen much in terms of the equestrian navy, or boats at all. Which, come to think of it, makes sense, doesn't it? If you can fly for enormous distances without a problem, the only reason you need a ship is to carry cargo back and forth. We don't even know if there's really an ocean in the same world.
There's a great storm.
Well, there is Manhattan, yes.
If they had flights,
Their map shows the side by two oceans.
if they had
To the
flights,
west, there's this giant
they really need
everlasting
boats.
storm.
I'm sorry?
If they've had flight for at least 1,000 years via Pegasi, have they ever really needed boats?
And there you're making the assumption that they always work together,
Which they didn't, we've seen that.
which they didn't. We've seen that, as the fine gentleman just exacerbated for me. So the idea is that we have three different species all working on their own enclaves. The unicorns probably have it easiest because they can do a little bit of both. So what's a Pegasi to do if he needs to dig a big hole but can't? The Pegasi have their own solution to this problem. They don't. They don't do it at all.
They blow it up.
When they didn't have earth ponies to dig or unicorns to magically dig, their society built itself up. Literally, up. They can walk on clouds. They can build with clouds. Cloudsdale. We've seen Cloudsdale is a very interesting study to subject to study. I apologize, I'm getting a bit nervous now. But Cloudsdale is fascinating. It's a wonderful thing to think about. The city on a hill. The idea of the city on the hill in the sky. I won't talk about the specific architecture. I'm from the north, I can't pronounce that word. Architecture we see in Cloudsdale. Doric, Ionic columns, that sort of thing is kind of out of my specific purview. But the materials are interesting. We have seen what looks like marble, limestone. Now marble and limestone at least is a sedimentary rock. It's built on layers. Also, you get shale from the same place. So that also suggests that they had to get it from somewhere. So Cloudsdale sounds like a multitude of things all working together. That's another example. That's why it's the city on the hill. Now the city on the hill, for those who aren't familiar with it, when the city of Boston was founded by the Puritans, it was thought to be a city on the hill. Now, granted, Boston was much less hill and more water at the time, but it was a city that was supposed to idealize cooperation and togetherness and perfection and some other religious stuff, but that's not quite as relevant. So we can see a little bit of that in Cloudsdale, and that's the magic of the Pegasi. Now we get to look at Canterlot. Now, the question is Canterlot a city, or is Canterlot the castle? Is it the keep, or everything around the keep too? One of the very interesting things we've seen about Canterlot is that it's built into the side of a mountain. Not the on the side of a mountain, where the mountain's going up here and it's here. It's the mountain is a vertical cliff, and it's just hanging on the side. That is definitely unicorn magic. But it's also intricately carved masonry. Masonry, as we've seen, has been the earth ponies. That's what they do. They build. They're kind of like dwarves, I am a dwarf and I'm digging a hole. If any of you have seen that, you get 10 points. There's one guy. There's 2, 3, 4.
It's already stuck in my head. Stop it.
Now the new one is much better in my mind. Example of cooperation. That kind of building would have been impossible without a portion of their race. Now we can argue about the how. We can say, was it built with hammer and chisel, with jackhammers? Because we've seen jackhammers. And that's its own interesting electrical question. But the otherwise, it's pretty fascinating. When you look at all of this stuff being built together, we've seen how their technology pushes them apart. We've seen how our modern technology pushes us apart while it's even putting us closer together. Look at Facebook, for example. I have maybe 150 odd Facebook friends. I know about 30 or 40 of them. Who else has a similar ratio? Go ahead and raise your hands. People you've never met, but you just happen to have on there. Definitely me. Definitely me. Now that's the kind of today's togetherness that's pushing us apart. But it's also allowing you to talk to these people. Again, my dad has told me stories of when he wanted to go meet interesting people, he'd go to conventions like this one, or he'd go down to the library and see what was saying there. Now, you can go on the internet. I won't say that's better or worse, it's not my purview, but it's still an interesting comparison. We've talked a whole lot about technology, and we've talked a whole lot about society. What we haven't talked about much is the interplay between them and where one changes the other. The cell phone, for example. In our world, it was built because we had people who needed to talk to one another immediately. Business, the military, and then, first it was military, then commercial, then available to everybody. Nifty little items, these things. So imagine, why don't ponies have them? Any guesses? Go ahead.
They don't have the need since they have things such as unicorn teleportation to get them through somebody extremely quickly and extreme precise speed.
All right.
So there's some need for that.
That's one idea. Up in front here.
Their society doesn't really depend on having to instantly speak to each other.
All the way in the back there. In the white? Mm-hmm. All right. You over there?
Maybe they use the magic so that they could, like, actually, communication magic, like, you've seen Spike, like, how he just blows out a letter, send it to someone. That's a good form of communication using magic.
But that's also assuming that everybody has a little dragon with them, which we've seen also doesn't happen much. Mm-hmm, she does. Over there in the brown?
Or it could be magic
Hmm?
programming.
You've all given me some really good ideas to build my answer on, which I appreciate. Because the answer is, frankly, we don't know. We've seen that they may have the equipment for it, and they might not. Basically, we couldn't invent the cell phone until we had the microtransistor. And that's a very interesting, one of the most interesting inventions of the last 20th century that just goes basically unnoticed. The transistor, the resistor, and all of those fancy named circuit board pieces. And I like that last idea. I really like that last idea. The missing component of the face-to-face. Now, face-to-face, especially for me, although you may not be guessing considering I'm talking to all of you all at once, has always been pretty hard because you miss out on some of the facial features, the cues, the way the voice changes. When I'm talking to you like this, it sounds pretty significantly different than when I'm talking like this, right? One sounds angry, the other is all nervous. But with somebody, unless you can read their face, you don't know the which. You don't know if it's angry, happy, that kind of thing. Got a question over there?
Yes, I actually have a question about the French side because it seems they can actually make light come out of clouds. It's an interesting feature.
That could actually be.
That could be, I was about to hear someone else explain it. That could be a couple of things. That could be their magic. We've seen them being able to manipulate clouds. Clouds, as we know them, are just fluffs of vapor. You stick your hand in it, you can wave it all you want. That's why you can walk through the fog and not, open your door, not be able to open the door in the morning. The other idea is it's unicorn magic. Maybe they've enchanted the clouds so they can, stomp, 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 zap. Or, frankly, I don't know. It may just be at the whim of the writer, much like Star Trek.
If they enchanted the clouds, if the unicorns did enchant the clouds, why would the unicorns have to walk on the clouds? Why like wouldn't they enchant the clouds so all races could walk on them?
That may just be a matter of scope. I mean,
So yeah, but with that in mind, that's assuming that only Pegasi have maybe like something in their body or the natural ability to walk on clouds.
It definitely could be an innate ability. There's even some of that kind of variation in humans. I think it's the Sherpas who live up in Mount Everest can have absolutely no problem there. They make some of the best pilots, best combat pilots, because they can breathe better oxygen. Or they can breathe better with less actual oxygen in the air. That's why if you go climbing Mount Everest, some of y'all are hikers, you need to carry some oxygen with you, because you can't breathe a very thin atmosphere. It's why Mars is going to be very interesting for humanity, because we don't have much in the way of not breathing breathable air. Got a question?
The possibility for how Pegasi create lightning. The way lightning works is it's charged particles colliding together and not really agreeing. All it could be
Violently disagreeing.
They have to jump on the clouds. Perhaps what they're doing is they're forcing these particles to make contact with one another, and that's creating the lightning.
A miniaturized.
They're artificial by using their natural ability to control weather. They're artificially creating lightning by just actually creating the process by which lightning naturally forms.
And that's another wonderful idea. A miniaturized atom smasher. I like that one. Now, as it stands, we've got about 15 minutes, but because you guys didn't ask as many questions as I prepared for, I love you guys, and there's a big crowd here. I don't have much else to talk about. So, here comes my personal favorite part, the question and answer. So you guys can go ahead and, if you have any questions for me at all, or maybe even for the crowd, go ahead. Right up front, in the blue.
How much of the world building do you think is an actual vision of the writers versus the things that you talk about that you see in the show that the writers just happen to stick in because it happened to fit the scene?
While I've never had the luxury of talking to the writers of the My Little Pony show, I did get a chance to talk to some of the folks who wrote for Star Trek, and I've heard some pretty strong comparisons between the writing styles for the two. For Star Trek, you bounce the graviton particle beam off the main deflector dish. Complete and utter nonsense. They made it up as they needed it. If you've seen Voltaire, that's plus 10 for that. So, for that, I think a good portion of it is making it up what they need for, because they're not focusing on the world, they're focusing on character interaction. It's a different side. It's like Star Trek. They're focusing on how the characters bounce off of one another, not what made things work real well. And that?
This could be asked by anyone, but pain, isn't that powered by independent magic? Is it electricity or?
It could be wind-up.
Because it looks like magic.
Miniature battery, maybe.
Pain, he has like.
Comes
like
lifestyle? Looks like a. Oh, if you see Tank's propeller, there's a little magical aura around it.
Got a question over there, guys?
That is magic.
You can see the magical.
Guys?
See a golden aura.
We do want to be able to hear people when they ask their questions.
So, if you were to compare the technology in Equestria to real world, like year in history, the technology they had at that point in time, what point in time do you think you would stand close?
Now that is a very interesting question, because we've seen. It depends on where you are. Just like in the real world, depends on the location. If you go out, I was visiting relatives out in Utah at one point, and it was hand-pushed carts and pumped water. Something out of the 1930s, 1940s. You go into Boston, modern, ultra-modern city. You go to Manhattan, probably an ultra-modern city. You go to Ponyville, you get architecture and stuff similar to, the 40s and 50s. It depends on where you go.
Are there any things we see in the show that warrant that symptoms allow for 1950? No specific examples of post-1950 tech occur to me.
Cone 3's turntable.
What?
Cone 3's
Yes.
Arcades.
I just didn't occur to me.
All right, we got in the middle of the back there. Yep. Mm-hmm. We talked about that for a portion of the first part of the talk. The assumption I made, and for the purposes of this panel, the assumptions I made were underground power lines. And that's supported by the idea of if you've got a lot of young flyers flying around and Pegasi flying around, you do not want them flying into live overhead power lines. I said it before, but that'll be a little bit too crispy for me. Guy in the red over there in the back. Mm-hmm. Potentially, but that runs on the problem of assumptions. And when you're dealing with this kind of thing, we could say it's marble, or we could say it's clouds. We don't have enough info. Over there with the horns?
How do you think alicorns fit into the evolution?
I was hoping for somebody to ask that question. Alicorns are a wonderful, wonderful anomaly. They're very strange creatures. We don't know where the original ones came from. We know Twilight was anointed one. We don't know where Cadence came from. Oh, they did explain that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Admittedly, I haven't been able to read the comics because I haven't gotten my hands on them.
According to Lawrence Bell's and Celestia and Luna were born like that.
Okay. So, but still, what brought them and what kick-started everything is much like the matter of the question at the beginning of our own universe. You can try and answer it 16 different ways, but what started everything is something that's plagued us since the beginning. And the Fluttershy shirt in the back there? Mm-hmm. That is another interesting question. As far as I recall, we haven't seen any active organized religion, but we've seen the kind of Gothic-inspired, 16th century Gothic-inspired architecture that was built off of the ideas at the time. We've also seen buildings that have steeples like churches, but could very well be state houses. That, it definitely is symbolism. It's chock full of that. But talking purely literally, we don't know yet. Over there in the white? The thing is, with that, well, honestly, I don't know. Some of the best examples of technology and wasted with that, some of the best workings from there I've seen in Followed Equestria. There's actually a panel tomorrow at 10 o'clock talking specifically about the military. And this is something I plan on attending, and I suggest you guys too. I'm planning to attend. I don't know who's running it, but for that military specifically, I'd say them. Otherwise, probably about the same as ours, maybe early gunpowder. Because the Chinese used gunpowder for a long time to make the niftiest fireworks before somebody had the idea, what if we hit them with a firework? Which has happened to me with an M80 firecracker, and I highly avoid it. I burn my eyebrows off. Trying to build a model rocket, cut it open, don't do that. Ever. Ever. They say on Mythbusters, don't do it. With a good reason. I burned my eyebrows off. Trust them. Now back to the topic. Over in the blue there?
Make a bigger point about the religion and also how it goes back to what we were talking about with cell phones and how they don't happen. We made the point earlier that in a society that values friendship so much, they may not have wanted to develop an instantaneous communication. In Equestria, we see not just a and those values that we work on this. Starfall period couldn't understand it. Celestia sends her best students to learn more about it. If the entire society is based on friendship being the ultimate peak of a mystical force.
It's magic.
Friendship is magic.
I really like that idea. An underlying mystical pushing force, a real entity, one of the nuclear forces, so to speak. He's gonna have the same hands. You, sir? Mhm. It very well could be. One of the ideas that I've heard floated around that I really liked was the idea of a outlet valve. With all of this stuff controlled well and done well, there's got to be somewhere where things are just a little wonky. Like, it happens on Earth. There are a couple places where the Earth's magnetic field gets all twisted, wibbly, wobbly, wonkily thing. Well, I didn't want to say timey-wimey, but yeah. But there are places where it pokes through. Yes. If you, up further north you go, the more obvious it is. Place just off of the coast of Bermuda, in the Bermuda Triangle, that is close to a magnetic north, so your compass will spin around, but eventually point to magnetic north, and you can navigate with that. But
Alternate theory about the Pegasi cloud lightning. What if that's what the majority of the electricity from the Ponyville Dam is supposed to be used for?
it's possible, but highly inefficient. So I wouldn't think it's doable, but without us making assumptions, it is possible. All the way in the back there, next to the Fluttershy. That's you.
That may just be a magical field of the planet, similar to. Okay, let's say what do you think about things?
Well, in that case, we are arguing in a different possibility. The temperatures on the surface of the sun, the surface, gets kind of wibbly when you get too close. It's pretty strange, but I think my con lead is trying to tell me this is all the time we have for today. So, again, thank you all for coming. If you have any personal questions, you can just hunt me down. I'll be here all week. Thank you again for coming. Have a wonderful con.